We will study from a test lesson with Rambash. I'll read from the study of the 10 Sefirot, part 5. Inner light, item 40. From the words, therefore, when the screen of Keter is refined from coarseness of face 4. Before that, we'll read from the study of the 10 Sefirot, item 40, in the words of the Ari. Afterwards, the light returns to being Mati in Keter, and then both Chub ascend there, Chochma and Bina, ascend there because of the desire they have. Then you find that there is a great distance between the sons and the light of Baal, for there are two distances between them, Bina and Chochma, in which there is no light. Hence, at that time, the light of Chesed rises to Bina and is called not Mati, not present in Chesed, not expanding in Chesed. In that state, the vessel of Chesed turns its anterior and gives 6 lights below in Gvura. Rabash he interprets here what is panim and the chol. On the one hand, we say panim, anterior, means he is bestowing. Posterior means he is not bestowing. He gives an example of a person giving something to his friend, standing before him, before his anterior, not before his posterior. Therefore, when he wants to insinuate the Ari, that the upper one gives to the lower one, he says that the upper one is standing face to face with the lower one. When he wants to tell us that he's not bestowing upon the lower one, then it is from the posterior to the lower one. Simple. There's another meaning of anterior and posterior. Anterior means chokhmah, as in man's wisdom makes his face shine, and chasadim means posterior of chokhmah. Therefore, he says, it is written that Keter, its posterior is downward. We learned what is the reason. Is it that he is not bestowing, or that he is bestowing only chasadim? He bestows only chasadim. Therefore, being Mati, expanding in Keter and his posterior downwards, means he's bestowing chasadim then. Why is he bestowing? You could say that there is no anterior. On the one hand, he wants to imply the abundance. Now he says it's in posterior again, meaning bestowing chasadim. That's why he says we should learn according to the context here. I wanted to give a simple interpretation of what is anterior, what is posterior. Anterior means what is important. What is important, we use. Posterior means what is not so important. That's why we don't use it, unless there is no choice. Therefore, we should learn several things. For example, when we are in the anterior, chokhmah not in now, posterior chasadim. Of course, chokhmah is more important than chasadim. When we say anterior means it's bestowing. So, of course, anterior, when it bestows, is more important than when not bestowing to the bestowing part, posterior. When we learn anterior and posterior of coarseness, certainly phase 4 when he uses it, it's called anterior. When it's in his posterior, it's phase 3. Why? It's not so important. If his phase is phase 3, then phase 2 is called posterior. So, There is anterior and posterior for the quality of the vessels, as we learned before, meaning the vessel of Bina. What is her anterior? What is important for her? Chasadim. What's not important for her? Posterior. That's already anterior and posterior. It's the quality of the vessels. You have anterior and posterior of the vessels themselves. Meaning, after the second restriction, Galgalta and Denai, that can be used or called anterior, and the Chab is called posterior. There's another example. There are many examples. Another example I want to clarify here. It is written in the words of the Ari, Mochin of Chaya is called Panim. As we said now, a Neshama is called posterior with respect to Chokhmah. He asks a question there in Inner Light about the words of the Ari that he brings there. When there is a Neshama of Chaya there, it's called Achorai, posterior. So he asks a question. The same thing. When he has Chaya of Neshama, it's called anterior. When he has Neshama of Chaya, it's called posterior. So he asks, according to the known rule, the lowest phase of the upper one is greater than all of the lower one. The lowest phase of the upper one is greater than all of the lower one. So how can it be that when he has Chaya of Neshama is called anterior, afterwards Neshama and Chaya is called posterior? So he explains this way. When the Ari speaks there about the mochin of procreation, and there's a rule, mochin of procreation must be the light of Chaya. Before he has mochin of Chaya, he cannot engender. So you find that he has Chaya of Neshama, he cannot engender. He has light of Chokhmah, which is of the degree. When he has Neshama of Chaya, he has a big degree. He cannot engender. He lacks a light of Chaya of the degree of Chokhmah. I only wanted to bring examples of anterior and posterior. It's all according to the context that he tells us here. For example, you're asking me if Chokhmah bestows Chasadim. I can say yes and no. What does that mean, yes and no? According to the order of degrees, there's a rule. The lower one does not have anything that is not found in the upper one, except what? It does not merit a name. It's not its degree. That's why he calls it a transition. There are degrees that descend to the lower one, which are basically only as transition. He doesn't use it if it's not his own degree, his own self. Sometimes the upper one uses it and gives to the lower one. That's the difference. When I say Keter bestows upon Chokhmah, Keter has wholeness. When you say Chokhmah gives to Bina, Chokhmah too is regarded as bestowing now, which is called Keter in that sense. When I speak of Keter that it receives, I can also call Keter a vessel. And evidence of this, Parsuf Ta'amim of the Guf. Don't I call it a vessel? Except there are distinctions. First degree Ta'amim of Galgalta, of Ab, where there was still no recognition of a vessel. But from there we learned we are speaking of vessels, the Ari says. Therefore, when the screen of Keter was refined from the coarseness of phase 4 and phase 3 in it to phase 3 and phase 2, fitting for the light of Chokhmah. It means fitting to receive Chokhmah, meaning the vessel is suitable for reception of Chokhmah. At that time, the vessel of Keter must turn its anterior downward and its posterior upward. In other words, the anterior toward the lower one. Why should the anterior be toward the lower one? What is the posterior of Keter? Chasadim. And what does a vessel of Chokhmah need? Chokhmah. So the posterior should be upward, not toward the lower one. What is the lower one here? It's anterior, meaning Chokhmah. You find that Keter gives Chokhmah to Chokhmah. What is a little perplexing here? On the one hand, we learn not expanding in Keter means that Keter was refined. There is no longer a vessel of Keter. On the other hand, I say that Keter does give. So we need to interpret accordingly. He doesn't give details about that. It's difficult to say if he doesn't say. How does the Gemara say? Something I did not hear, we do not say. But the meaning is this, that we say that there is an order of degree. So there is 3-2 in Keter, but that's not regarded, not expanding in Keter. It's not her degree. But the lower face has it. She has it. You find that when we say that the light of Keter controls the Keter of Keter, who is in posterior, it is actually when the vessel of Keter has 4 of clothing. But afterwards, in the degree of 3-2, which she gives it to Chokhmah, it's not her degree, as if it doesn't have Keter. Otherwise, it's difficult. What does it mean, giving anterior to anterior?
The vessel of Keter, I'll repeat it. It must turn its anterior downward and its posterior upward. This is because its posterior delay the illumination of Chokhmah completely. Mercy, why does it detain it? Because the root of Keter, the root that stands under the Malchut of Rosh, why doesn't it illuminate? There is no fourth phase of coarseness, only phase 4 of clothing. As long as that is the state, it just continues on that degree. But phase 3 of coarseness doesn't disturb it. Why? Because there's already a screen on it. However, the cause of the above turning of the anterior, now he repeats, who will change its face? He says a different reason. It is the matter of refinement of the screen of the male of Keter, phase 4 of clothing, which is a record that the root Keter left. The Keter would illuminate in Partzuf Galgalta is this vessel of Keter after its departure from it, since the record of phase 4 of clothing departed from there. Because it was refined and came to the coarseness of phase 3, the control of the root Keter on its vessel stopped. Why? There's no phase 4 there, and it turns to its anterior downward, meaning it could already bestow Chokhmah. Why? Because there was no one to disturb it. And everything that is attributed to the illumination of the root of Keter ascend once more to the Rosh. Its residue, meaning the record of phase 3 of the first expansion, which is the male of Chokhmah, and the illumination of the new coupling that emerged on the coarseness of phase 3, that the Nukva of Keter left after the refinement. It became phase 2 because the female of the vessel of Chokhmah, 3 rise to the Rosh, the light comes out on phase 4 upon 3, ascends to the Rosh of the degree. So what's left of 4-3? 3-2. That gives to the vessel of Chokhmah. Here he writes that the posterior are called Chasadim, mercy. The back are called Vak, Chokhmah is called Gar. What is Gar? The first 3 Sefirot? It's wholeness. So I'm telling you that's also not a rule. Why? We learn many times that Zeranpin has wholeness by having Gar of Bina as Chafetz Chesed. It's called Gar of Bina, the lower one. Zeranpin has wholeness of the Gar of Bina. We learn that Bina is called Chasadim, only mercy. So I say sometimes that Gar is called wholeness, sometimes degrees have wholeness of mercy. For example, Bina, it's the opposite. Her posterior is lacking Chokhmah. It's not important for her. What is important? Chasadim. That's why we learn now the quality of the vessels, that there is a difference between the face and back. Like in the vessel of Keter, what are her face? Chasadim. And her posterior, her back is Chokhmah. Why? Keter bestows. This time, her face is only Chasadim. So when I say that it didn't expand in Chokhmah, but expanded in Keter, so what illuminates in Keter? Only Chasadim on all degrees. So why is it called face? Because it bestows. What does it bestow? The Achoraim, the back of the phase of Vak. That's why it's hard to discern. For example, we learn that all the wholeness that exists in the Parzuf of Atzilut, when it has greatness, it has Chokhmah, it's a correction called Mem Lamed Tzadik of Tzelem, if you remember. So what illuminates? Only Vak of Chokhmah. You see, Vak is called Chokhmah. That's why everything, according to them, you just cannot determine words with no meaning. It all has to be, you have to use a bit of your mind here too. He asks if there's a rule, because there are no changes in the lights. All the changes are only in the vessels. There's a rule. The vessel is called Malchut. If so, there's only one vessel. Why are there so many changes? All the changes that we're talking about are in Malchut. What change did she receive? For instance, Malchut of the Parzuf Keter, called Tamim, has phase 4 of clothing. For who? For that Malchut of the degree. When I say Keter, there is no light that won't have 10 Sefirot. There are already 9 first Sefirot and Malchut. When I speak of Malchut of a degree, the vessel of Chokhmah, what is the vessel of Chokhmah? There are 10 Sefirot. And now I say that Malchut receives the first 9 of Chokhmah. So who gets the changes? Only Malchut. We find that Malchut has all those changes, and the light, it's the same thing. I gave an example about it, if you remember. That if I see a plane flying, let's say 50,000 feet above the earth, and there are 10 people there. One has good binoculars, one has a bit less, and one does not have binoculars, only using his eyes. So one say, oh, it's a big plane, it's 1 meter. The other one says, no, it's 80 centimeters. One says 50, one says 10. So who's telling the truth? Everybody.
Everyone.
Because all they see is the truth. Do they make changes in the plane? No. It's the same thing. The changes are only in the vessels, each one according to what he attains, according to what he can receive. But in the light, there's no change. How could it be? I say that one color is this, he sees a different color. You don't make any changes in the plane. All the change, and everybody's telling the truth. Everybody sees something and gets inspired by it, whether big or small. So what is the meaning of this? That all the changes that we learn are only compared according to the lower ones. He explains it even more. He says this. What is a record, a reshimo? It means that the light was there and departed, and he leaves a small part of it. That's why we learn, right? So where did that light go to? There's no place. Just if he sees that the light departed, the vessel could now attain it, just a small part. A small part of what he sees from the light, that's called the record, but it's the same light. There are no changes in the light. The light, some little piece was left below. But when he sees the light from afar, a very small illumination, he calls that a record. But not that it was sliced from the light. The light departed, but a small part was sliced and left in the vessel. That's a way to understand it. Now we shall explain interior and posterior of the vessel of Chokhmah. Chokhmah's conduct is to bestow only Chokhmah. That's its quality. Hence, the place of bestowal in Chokhmah is her anterior. But Keter, we learn the opposite, that the place of the posterior Chasadim, and on the side of bestowal it's called face, the abundance is called posterior. But in Chokhmah, also the abundance and also the bestowing is called face. That's what he writes. Hence, the place of bestowal in Chokhmah is her anterior, and the place of bestowal of light of Chasadim. While she doesn't have Chokhmah, only mercy, only Chasadim, she gives to Binah, let's say, the place of bestowal of the light of Chasadim is her posterior. In other words, it is the complete opposite from Keter, from one end to the other. The anterior of Keter is to bestow Vak, mercy, and illumination of Gar, meaning Chokhmah. It's the Gar of Chokhmah. It is in her posterior. At the same time, the interior of Chokhmah is the illumination of Gar, which is called the phase of light of Chokhmah. And her posterior is the illumination of Vak. So, on the side of Chasadim, we learn that there's a difference between the vessel of Chokhmah and the vessel of Keter. It's clear? So he asks this. He gives us the quality of the vessels of Partzuf Ab. He mentioned that it didn't expand in Keter. The Keter is the Te'amim. It doesn't shine to the lower ones in Chokhmah, only in Chasadim. When I say that it expanded in Keter, it doesn't illuminate to the lower ones, only Chasadim. So on its own behalf, I'm not speaking only what it bestows to the lower ones. Chokhmah, when it illuminates to the lower ones. Chokhmah, the vessel of Chokhmah. And we learned, what was the explanation? Why can't Keter bestow Chokhmah? We explain that it's because the light of Keter standing below Malchut of the Rosh has phase 4 of coarseness, and it departed the phase 4 of coarseness. That's why it cannot shine below in the vessels. That's why its vessel has phase 4 of clothing. It also illuminates, so it won't be Chokhmah, only Chasadim.